So the trial of Mo Chara from Kneecap has been suspended. People may know the Irish rap trio. One of them has been charged with essentially giving succor to terrorism. It's alleged that he flew a Hezbollah banner at one of his gigs. Tom, this is the best thing to happen to Kneecap, isn't it? The fact that, they've never get publicity like this otherwise.
I mean, it's very rare that you could say that being brought up on terror charges is the best thing that could ever happen to someone. But I think in this case, that's 100% true. Obviously, this is, it goes about saying outrageous where freedom of speech is concerned, being these outrageous, provocative, Israelophobic rappers, them doing these things to get a rise out of people. It is despicable when you're waving around the banner of an anti-Semitic terror army who have been, pummeling Israel for so many years. But at the same time, to suggest that this is some sort of involvement in terrorism or direct incitement to violence when the audience they're performing this to probably have never thrown a punch, let alone thrown any munitions, seems to me a bit ridiculous. And obviously, they should not have been hauled up on charges for this. They shouldn't have been investigated. State in which you've got the counter-terror police investigating rappers is clearly not in a very good state where freedom of speech is concerned. All that being said, it's been a perfect example, hasn't it, of the way in which censorship in certain circumstances can play so perfectly into the target's hands. If anyone saw the scenes outside of Westminster Magistrates Court this week where you had hundreds of people gathering, waving placards or wearing their kind of trademark Kneecap balaclavas, which look a lot more like kind of tea cozies, really, but not as menacing as maybe they thought. It's allowed them to pose as they've wanted to pose throughout their short career as sort of radicals. They could originally burst onto the scene, titillating the English middle classes with IRA slogans, and now they've moved quite naturally into kind of anti-Israel bigotry. So it's one of those things where they wanted to pose as incredibly edgy, as a threat to the British establishment, and so on and so forth. And even though they're not, by any stretch of the imagination, it's a kind of character act cosplaying kind of exercise that they're involved in. It's fed into that narrative absolutely beautifully. So I wish that far fewer people took this ban seriously, much less the counter-terror police.
Joe, yeah.
Yeah, no, well, I agree with that. And I think it was interesting what you were saying in your Spike column today, Tom, about this being a very good example of the Streisand effect. I mean, I've got to confess, as a middle-aged woman who's not really up with the hip-hop scene.
You're not missing anything from these three, I should say that one.
Well,
bad.
I would not have heard of Kneecap if it hadn't been for all this publicity around them and the news, the way they kind of made headlines, first of all, predominantly for these anti-Israeli pathetic stunts that they pull, and this kind of pseudo Irish nationalist, anti-British kind of sentiment. I did try and listen to a few of their songs, and my ears started to bleed, and I gave up. I mean, it was more than I could stomach. And so then you look at the politics and you just think, actually, okay, as a middle-aged woman, I actually think my politics are more radical than theirs. What exactly are they saying that it is not said by every kind of, BBC journalist, Guardian columnist? It just seems that this is really, apart from that stupid stunt of the Hezbollah flag, their politics is absolutely the mainstream of political thought at the moment. The whole thing is just boring. The music is boring. The politics is boring. The only thing that's at all interesting about this group is the very fact that they've been put up on this trial. If we had more free speech, I could go to bed quite happily at night, never having heard of them.
And it's all too telling, isn't it, that there have been these sort of open letters from various lovies and, cultural figures in support of Kneecap, people saying absurdly that, you're censored if you talk about Israel, Palestine, and you think this is the most talked about. But people would, I'd quite like people to shut up about it sometimes. How could they, whereas, I don't know, someone like Lucy Connolly, I know she's not, she's not an artistic figure, for instance, but there's no support in that world for someone like that, for being able to speak their mind.
And I imagine that's part of the frustration why some people on the more kind of pro-free speech side of the argument maybe join the clamour for this particular set of charges maybe too readily, was because of the fact that they've seen people be put in prison for far less than openly appearing to celebrate anti-Semitic terror army. I mean, there's people who were being certainly arrested for misgendering, and yet the very people who are writing these very noble open letters about freedom of expression were nowhere to be seen when that took place. So we found out where their line is, but this line is all over the place, seemingly.
Yeah.
So there's sort of double standards all the way down, but I think it's another good example, isn't it, of why the answer to two-tier speech restrictions or the answer to double standards is not to enforce the censorship more evenly. It's to argue against it from a point of principle. I suppose we've got a chance to here